The night was warm, and the city lights sparkled like 1,000 little stars. The streets were alive with people hurrying past, some dressed in casual clothes, others in outfits that glittered and shimmered, reflecting the excitement of the evening. A grand mansion sat on the top of the hill, bigger and brighter than any other house in the neighborhood. Its doors were open wide, and music could be heard even before entering. Inside, the lights glowed softly, highlighting the luxurious furniture, polished floors, and crystal chandeliers that hung from the ceiling. It was the kind of place that could make anyone feel small, and for the guests who had received invitations, it was a night of elegance and celebration. Among the people arriving was a young waitress. She was not part of the elite world of wealth and fame that filled the mansion that night. She had spent the day serving tables at a small cafe, and now she was here to work, carrying trays of drinks, making sure guests were satisfied, and moving through the crowd without drawing attention to herself. Her uniform was simple, and she blended into the background, listening to the laughter and chatter that filled the room. She had learned to stay quiet in such situations, letting others enjoy the spotlight while she did her job. Despite being in a place so different from her normal life, she felt a strange excitement. The mansion was beautiful, with walls decorated in gold accents and paintings that seemed to tell stories. The staircase was wide and elegant, with a red carpet that ran its entire length. Guests moved up and down, chatting and taking photos, while waiters and waitresses like her weaved carefully through them, carrying drinks and trays with steady hands. She had done this many times before, but tonight felt different. The air was filled with a sense of importance, and she could feel the energy in the room, a mix of anticipation and pride that came from being in a place where wealth and status were on display. As she moved from table to table, she caught sight of the host for the evening. The millionaire was tall, confident, and clearly used to commanding attention. He was talking to his guests, smiling, laughing, and occasionally letting out a deep, confident laugh that made everyone listen. He wore a tailored suit that fit perfectly, and his eyes scanned the room like a hawk. She could feel his gaze briefly resting on her as she passed by, and a shiver ran down her spine. There was something in his look, a mix of curiosity and judgment, that made her heart beat a little faster. She had seen people like him before, people who thought they could decide someone's worth in a glance, but she had learned not to let it bother her. The music in the background was lively, a mixture of classical and modern tunes that filled the space with energy. Waitresses moved carefully, making sure glasses were full, picking up crumbs, and keeping the guests happy without being noticed. She balanced a tray of champagne glasses, moving with a steady grace that came from years of practice. Even when a guest reached out suddenly or bumped into her, she kept her composure, smiling politely, never letting the tension show. She knew that in this world, appearances mattered as much as actions, and she was determined not to make a mistake. While she worked, she overheard snippets of conversations. Guests were talking about investments, exotic vacations, and expensive cars. Some were comparing their homes, while others were complimenting the food and the wine. She listened quietly, learning to understand the way these people thought, noticing the patterns in their speech, the way they laughed at certain jokes, and the way their eyes flickered to show interest or boredom. She had always been observant, and this skill helped her navigate through the crowd without trouble. Despite the grandeur and the wealth around her, she kept her focus on her work. She delivered drinks with a polite smile, thanked guests when they tipped her, and made sure not to spill anything. She had seen what could happen when mistakes were made in such an environment, and she was determined to be careful. At the same time, she couldn't help but admire the beauty of the mansion. The chandeliers sparkled with every movement, the polished floors reflected the lights perfectly, and the large windows offered a view of the city below, glowing in the evening dark. It was then that she noticed the piano. It was placed in the center of the room, its black surface shining under the lights, and its polished keys promising beautiful music. She had played the piano since she was a child, and even though she rarely performed in public, her hands itched at the thought of sitting down and letting the music flow. But she shook her head gently, reminding herself that tonight she was here to work, not to perform. She focused on her tasks, moving through the crowd, but her eyes kept returning to the piano, a small smile tugging at her lips. The millionaire moved closer, and she could sense his presence behind her. He watched her as she carefully set a tray of drinks on a table, his expression unreadable. There was a hint of a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. She continued her work, ignoring him, keeping her attention on the guests. She had learned long ago that looking too much at someone's gaze could give them power over you, and she refused to let that happen. As the night progressed, the party became livelier. Laughter echoed through the hall, glasses clinked, and the smell of delicious food filled the air. The young waitress moved gracefully, making sure everything ran smoothly. She noticed a few guests looking at her, some with curiosity, some with surprise at her calm demeanor in such a place. She smiled politely at them, saying small words of thanks, always keeping her posture straight and her movements smooth. Then, a sudden moment of tension arrived. The millionaire spoke, his voice cutting through the music and chatter. He asked a guest about a particular topic, then turned his gaze toward her. For a moment, the room seemed to pause, and she felt all eyes on her. A shiver ran down her spine, but she straightened, holding her head high. She knew that whatever was about to happen, she had to remain composed. The millionaire made a casual comment, his tone light but edged with something sharper. He asked if she could play the piano. His eyes were watching her closely, and she could feel a tension in the air, a challenge hidden behind his words. She paused for a moment, her heart beating faster, but then she smiled politely and nodded. It was a simple gesture, but it held a quiet confidence. She had been through many challenges before, and this was just another test. As she approached the piano, guests began to turn their heads. Some whispered, others watched with mild curiosity, expecting perhaps a small, simple performance. She took a deep breath, feeling the smooth keys beneath her fingers. The room seemed to quiet slightly, as if holding its breath in anticipation. The millionaire's eyes narrowed slightly, a smirk playing on his lips, confident that he had set the stage for his own amusement. The young waitress sat down at the piano, her back straight, her hands poised. She felt a mixture of nerves and excitement, but mostly a quiet determination. She reminded herself of all the hours she had spent practicing, the sacrifices, and the love she had for music. It was her world, and tonight, even here in this grand mansion, she was ready to step into it. The guests leaned in, curious about what would happen next, while the millionaire watched, certain he was in control. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the sounds of the party fade into the background. Then, with a deep breath, she prepared to play. The first note was about to be pressed, a sound that could change the tone of the entire evening. All around her, the chandeliers glowed, the guests leaned in, and the millionaire's confident smirk remained, unaware of the surprise that awaited him. It was a moment suspended in time, a moment before the music began, a moment before everything changed. The young waitress had sat down at the grand piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. The air in the room had changed slightly, a quiet anticipation settling over the guests. The millionaire, standing nearby, let a small, calculating smile spread across his face. He believed this was his moment to demonstrate just how out of place she was, to make everyone laugh at the idea of a simple waitress trying to perform in such a high-class environment. He leaned casually against a table, swirling a glass of wine, clearly enjoying the thought of embarrassing her. He spoke loudly enough for some of the guests to hear, his words cutting through the soft hum of the party music. "Can you really play?" he asked, a tone of mockery hidden beneath polite curiosity. His eyes glittered with challenge. The guests looked at the waitress, some smirking, expecting to see a failed performance, imagining the awkwardness that would follow. She felt the pressure but refused to let it show on her face. She had learned early that confidence was key, even when the situation seemed unfair. She took a deep breath, placing her fingers gently on the keys. She felt the cool smoothness under her touch and reminded herself of all the hours she had spent practicing. The piano had been her companion since childhood, a safe place where she could express everything she felt. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the melodies she had memorized for years fill her mind. This was not a place for fear, she told herself silently. This was a place to show who she truly was. The millionaire leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. His smirk had grown wider, certain that the room was about to be entertained by a display of clumsiness. He had invited many of his wealthy friends, people who shared his sense of superiority, and he was convinced they would all enjoy the spectacle of a simple waitress trying to play the piano in his grand mansion. He whispered something to a friend nearby, and they chuckled softly, their laughter quiet but sharp, meant to be shared with only a few. The young waitress heard it but kept her focus. A few guests started murmuring among themselves, some leaning closer to get a better view. They were curious, some out of genuine interest, some out of amusement. The room had a strange energy, a mixture of tension and excitement. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The young waitress felt the weight of all those eyes upon her, but she did not panic. Instead, she let herself relax into the music she was about to create. The first note she played was soft but clear, filling the room with a sound that was unexpectedly beautiful. The guests blinked, caught off guard by the sweetness of the tone. The millionaire's eyebrows rose slightly, the smirk faltering for just a moment. He had expected hesitation, awkwardness, maybe even a wrong note, but instead, the music was gentle and precise. The young waitress continued, letting the notes flow naturally, her hands moving over the keys with grace and confidence. The melody grew stronger, the notes weaving together in a way that demanded attention. Guests began to stop their chatter, their conversations fading into silence as they listened. Some leaned forward, captivated by the performance, while others exchanged surprised looks. Even the staff, moving quietly in the background, paused to hear the music more clearly. The young waitress felt a quiet satisfaction. She knew that she was showing her real talent, not for applause, not for recognition, but because it was part of who she was. The millionaire shifted slightly, his posture stiffening. He could not hide the shock on his face. His plan to humiliate her was unraveling, and he felt a sting of doubt. He had underestimated her skill, and now, instead of laughter, he was hearing admiration from the guests. The whispers that had been meant to mock were now comments of awe. Some guests were quietly nodding, impressed by her technique and the emotion she put into the music. The room had transformed, the piano becoming the center of attention, and she was commanding it without even trying. She moved through the music effortlessly, letting her fingers glide over the keys. Each note seemed to tell a story of patience, dedication, and love for music. The melodies were familiar to her, yet in the moment, they felt fresh and alive. The guests were mesmerized, some closing their eyes to feel the music more fully, others leaning in to watch the intricate movements of her hands. The millionaire could no longer control the scene, and he felt a tightening in his chest, a rare moment of discomfort. He tried to regain his composure, attempting a polite clap as she finished a particularly difficult passage. But it was half-hearted, and everyone could tell that the admiration in the room was not directed toward him. The young waitress continued, her confidence growing with each note. She was no longer just a waitress at a party. She had become the highlight, the person everyone wanted to watch and listen to. The music carried through the room, touching people in ways that no wealth or status could replicate. The millionaire's friends started to whisper among themselves, casting glances at him, noticing the change in his expression. The plan had backfired spectacularly, and the realization began to settle in. The young waitress was commanding the room with her talent, and no one could deny the power of her performance. It was as if she had transformed the atmosphere, turning skepticism into admiration and doubt into amazement. Some guests started to clap softly, a few even standing to show their appreciation. The young waitress did not let it distract her. She kept her focus on the music, letting it flow naturally. Each note was intentional, filled with emotion and skill. The piano sang under her hands, and the room responded, caught in a wave of beauty and surprise. She felt a quiet pride but remained humble, letting the music speak for her rather than her words. The millionaire realized that the night had taken a turn he could not control. He had thought himself clever, confident that he could humiliate someone to entertain his friends. Now he felt a mix of anger, embarrassment, and respect. The young waitress had turned his plan upside down without even trying, using only her talent and calm presence. The guests were enchanted, and he could do nothing to change their perception. She had earned their admiration honestly and effortlessly. As she played, the room seemed to shrink around the piano, everyone focused entirely on her. The music created an invisible connection, binding strangers together in shared amazement. Even the staff paused in their duties, caught in the spell of her performance. The young waitress felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She was doing what she loved, in front of people who had never expected her to shine. Each note was a small triumph, a victory over doubt, and a demonstration of the power of quiet confidence. The millionaire watched as the performance continued, a knot forming in his stomach. He had underestimated the young waitress, and the realization stung. His friends were nodding and smiling, complimenting the music, while he stood awkwardly, unable to interject or reclaim the moment. It was a rare experience for him, to be outshined, to see someone rise above his expectations and capture the attention of everyone in the room. He felt a grudging respect, though he would never admit it aloud. The young waitress transitioned seamlessly between melodies, showing off her technical skill and emotional depth. She played a piece that moved from gentle and tender to bold and dramatic, captivating every listener. Her fingers flew across the keys, each movement precise, yet full of life. Guests whispered their amazement, and some even reached for their phones to record the moment. The music had created a story that needed no words, and everyone could feel it. The millionaire realized that he had been defeated not by confrontation or argument, but by something far more powerful: talent, confidence, and authenticity. The young waitress had turned an attempt at humiliation into a moment of triumph. She had proven, without a single boast, that her skill was real and that she could command a room with her art. The atmosphere had shifted completely, and he could no longer control the narrative. The admiration of the guests was hers entirely. As the performance reached its climax, the music soared, filling every corner of the grand hall. The guests were captivated, some leaning forward, others closing their eyes, all listening intently. The young waitress felt a surge of joy, the culmination of years of dedication and practice, finally recognized in a way that mattered. The notes she played were more than sound. They were a statement, a declaration of her abilities and her inner strength. When the final note lingered in the air, the room erupted in applause. The guests were on their feet, clapping and cheering, their faces full of admiration and delight. The young waitress smiled quietly, bowing her head in gratitude. She had faced a challenge, and she had risen to it with grace and talent. The millionaire looked on, a mixture of shock, frustration, and respect evident in his expression. He had tried to humiliate her, but instead, he had witnessed something extraordinary, a reminder that true skill and confidence could not be diminished by arrogance or wealth. The young waitress stood, letting the applause wash over her without letting it overwhelm her. She had shown who she was, not through words or pride, but through the music she loved. The guests continued to talk excitedly, sharing their amazement with each other. The millionaire quietly stepped back, acknowledging the moment, realizing that some victories could not be claimed through wealth or status alone. The evening had changed, and she had changed it, even in a room full of power and privilege, proving that talent and confidence always shine brighter than arrogance. The music from the piano began to spread throughout the grand hall, weaving through the chatter and the clinking of glasses. Guests who had been whispering and smirking now found themselves drawn to the melody, unable to resist the beauty of the sound. Each note seemed to reach into the room, carrying with it a sense of calm and awe. The young waitress's hands moved over the keys with effortless grace, and her eyes were focused yet calm, as if she were in her own world where nothing else mattered. She shifted seamlessly from one piece to another, blending gentle, flowing melodies with powerful, dramatic notes that filled every corner of the room. The guests were mesmerized, They had expected a simple performance, perhaps a nervous attempt that would elicit polite applause at best. Instead, they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that captured not just the ears, but the hearts of everyone present. Even the staff paused to listen, carefully continuing their work but unable to ignore the beauty of the music. The millionaire stood near the back, his expression a mixture of disbelief and unease. He had expected to dominate the evening, to use his wealth and status to entertain and amuse, but now he found himself outmatched by a young waitress. The plan he had hatched to humiliate her had failed completely. His smirk was gone, replaced by a subtle tension he could not hide. He watched as the crowd leaned in, captivated by every note she played, and felt a flicker of envy he had never anticipated. Guests were moving closer, unable to resist the pull of the music. Some leaned on tables to get a better view. Others whispered quietly to their companions about how skilled she was. There were glances exchanged between strangers, each one acknowledging the talent and passion displayed on the piano. People who had arrived expecting a night of luxury and superficial conversations were now united in admiration for a single, unexpected performance. The young waitress continued to play, her fingers flying over the keys, hitting each note with precision and feeling. She moved effortlessly from gentle, tender melodies to bold, dramatic ones that demanded attention. The contrast of softness and strength kept the audience engaged, as if the music itself was telling a story that words could not capture. Every chord she played resonated with emotion, and every guest felt the energy of her performance in their own way. Some of the guests were moved to the point of tears, touched by the sincerity and depth of her playing. Others were wide-eyed, impressed by the technical skill and the speed with which she navigated complex passages. Every note spoke of years of practice, patience, and a love for music that went beyond performance. It was a form of self-expression, pure and unfiltered. The room seemed to shrink around her, with every listener focused entirely on the piano and the person behind it. The millionaire tried to regain control, attempting a polite clap at the end of one particularly difficult sequence. It came off as forced and awkward, and it was clear to everyone that he was unsettled. He had underestimated her, and now he was watching as the young waitress transformed the atmosphere. She was no longer a simple presence in the room. She had become the center of attention, commanding admiration without a word, simply through the music she loved. As the performance progressed, the young waitress incorporated subtle variations in tempo and dynamics, showing off not just her technical ability, but her deep understanding of the emotion behind each piece. The guests were completely absorbed, some holding their breath during quiet, delicate passages, others leaning forward in anticipation of the next powerful crescendo. The music had a life of its own, and everyone in the room was caught in its flow. A few of the more skeptical guests tried to hide their surprise, exchanging glances with their neighbors in disbelief. They had come expecting a casual, unremarkable evening, but now they were witnessing something profoundly moving. The contrast between their expectations and reality heightened their admiration. They whispered words of praise, some discreetly taking out their phones to capture the moment, while others simply allowed themselves to be present, enjoying the authenticity of the experience. The young waitress felt a quiet satisfaction as she played. She was aware of the eyes on her, the admiration, and even the challenge posed by the millionaire's presence. But she did not let it distract her. Instead, she let it fuel her focus, allowing the music to flow naturally. Each note was deliberate, each pause meaningful. She had prepared for performances in small halls and community events, but this was different. This was a moment where her talent could shine in a world that often overlooked people like her. As she transitioned into a particularly dramatic section, the dynamics of the music changed. Her hands moved with speed and precision, creating a surge of sound that filled the room with energy. The audience responded instinctively. Some clapped softly in rhythm. Others sat in stunned silence, completely captivated by the mastery of the performance. The room was alive with emotion, the music connecting everyone in a way that transcended social status or wealth. The millionaire could no longer hide his reaction. He shifted from foot to foot, trying to maintain a composed demeanor, but his discomfort was evident. He had expected control, dominance, and amusement, but instead, he had been confronted with undeniable talent. The young waitress had claimed the room without seeking attention, simply by being true to herself and her passion. He watched as guests complimented each other quietly, exchanging smiles and nods of appreciation, all directed toward her. Her fingers moved effortlessly, the music becoming more intricate, more emotionally charged. She blended technical skill with artistic expression, creating a performance that was both mesmerizing and deeply moving. The room seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the piano, every listener caught in a web of beauty that had no need for words. The young waitress had transformed the party, turning what could have been a night of shallow entertainment into an unforgettable experience. The guests, now fully absorbed, forgot their own conversations, their own sense of superiority, and simply listened. Some had tears in their eyes, others had smiles of amazement, and a few simply held their hands over their hearts, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling conveyed through the music. It was as if the piano had become a bridge, connecting people in a shared moment of wonder, and the young waitress was the guide leading them through it. Even the staff, who had been moving quietly in the background, were drawn to the performance. They paused in their work, careful not to interrupt, but unable to resist watching and listening. They shared quiet glances with each other, silently acknowledging the remarkable skill of someone they had known simply as a colleague in a cafe. It was a reminder that talent can exist anywhere, and that it often shines brightest when least expected. The young waitress's performance reached a powerful climax, her fingers moving with a speed and precision that left everyone in awe. The notes soared, filling the room with energy, passion, and emotion. The guests were on the edge of their seats, completely captivated. The millionaire could only watch, realizing that his plan to humiliate her had completely backfired. She had turned doubt into admiration, skepticism into awe, and she had done it effortlessly. When the final notes echoed and faded into silence, the room remained still for a heartbeat, as if no one could believe what they had just experienced. Then, applause erupted. The sound was thunderous, coming from all corners of the room. Guests stood, clapping enthusiastically, some cheering quietly, others exchanging looks of amazement. The young waitress allowed herself a small, humble smile, acknowledging the appreciation without letting it distract from the moment. The millionaire took a step back, his face a mixture of surprise and begrudging respect. He had tried to control the evening, to assert his dominance, but he had been undone by talent and authenticity. He watched as the guests continued to talk excitedly about the performance, realizing that he could no longer claim attention or authority in that moment. The young waitress had captured the hearts of everyone in the room without a single boast, simply through the beauty of her music. The young waitress rose from the piano, letting the applause wash over her. She bowed slightly, a gesture of gratitude to the audience, then stepped back to allow the room to settle. She had faced a challenge, and she had met it with grace, skill, and confidence. The guests were buzzing with admiration, some still whispering to each other about how extraordinary the performance had been. Even those who had come expecting to mock her were now part of a shared moment of wonder. As she stepped away from the piano, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had not only played music but had also transformed the evening. The party, with all its wealth and prestige, had been temporarily suspended by her talent. She had proven that skill and dedication can command respect, regardless of social standing. The young waitress walked through the room with her head held high, proud of her performance and the way it had touched the people around her. The millionaire looked on, knowing that he had underestimated her, and that the evening would be remembered not for his wealth or power, but for the talent and courage of someone he had tried to humiliate. The young waitress's hands flew across the keys with a confidence that seemed almost magical. The music had grown stronger, more expressive, moving through soft, tender moments into powerful crescendos that filled every corner of the grand hall. Guests were completely captivated, leaning in as if afraid to miss a single note. Even the staff, busy with their duties, paused to listen, drawn by the beauty and emotion flowing from the piano. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The party was no longer about wealth or status, but about the music that touched everyone present. The millionaire stood off to the side, tension visible in the lines of his face. He had expected to dominate the evening, to control the attention, and perhaps humiliate someone in the process. Instead, he watched in silence as the young waitress commanded the room effortlessly. Every note she played carried precision, emotion, and a sense of freedom that he could not control. He could feel the admiration of the guests shifting away from him and toward her, and a rare feeling of helplessness began to settle in. As she moved into a particularly dramatic passage, the dynamics of her playing drew gasps from some guests. The music was no longer just sound. It was a story unfolding, full of tension, release, and emotion. Her fingers moved with breathtaking speed and accuracy, creating a cascade of notes that seemed to float in the air before landing perfectly. The guests leaned forward, completely enthralled, caught up in the wave of sound that washed over the room. Whispers of astonishment spread quietly through the crowd. Some whispered about how skilled she was, while others commented on the emotional depth of the performance. Guests who had previously been distracted by conversations or their phones now focused entirely on the piano and the young woman who played it. The energy of the room had shifted, and it was impossible to deny the power of her performance. She had taken something as simple as a piano and transformed it into a force that captivated the hearts and minds of everyone in the room. The young waitress felt the growing connection with her audience. She played not for recognition or praise, but because the music was a part of her soul that she had spent years nurturing. Every note told a story, every pause carried meaning. The guests were not just listening. They were experiencing the emotions she poured into the keys, feeling joy, longing, tension, and release in turn. Even those who had come expecting to mock her were now silent, unable to resist the pull of the music. The millionaire shifted uneasily, realizing that his plan had backfired completely. He had underestimated her, expecting embarrassment, yet here he was, watching her rise above his assumptions with grace and talent. His eyes followed her every move, noting the confidence in her posture, the precision in her fingers, and the calm determination in her expression. She had turned his attempt at humiliation into a moment of triumph, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The young waitress transitioned into a softer, more delicate section. Her hands danced across the keys lightly, producing a melody that was both tender and haunting. Guests leaned closer, some closing their eyes to fully immerse themselves in the sound. The room had gone completely quiet, except for the piano, which sang with clarity and emotion. The music seemed to create a bond among the guests, connecting them in shared admiration and wonder. The millionaire's friends began exchanging glances, their expressions mirroring a mixture of surprise and amazement. They had expected entertainment, but instead were witnessing an extraordinary display of talent. The young waitress's performance had captured their attention completely, leaving them in awe of someone they had likely overlooked before. Their whispers were filled with genuine praise, a testament to the power of her skill and the sincerity of her playing. As she moved into the final section, the music grew bold and powerful. Her fingers struck the keys with authority, creating a sound that filled the grand hall with resonance. The dynamics of the piece shifted seamlessly, moving from gentle, flowing passages to dramatic, commanding chords. The guests were caught in the ebb and flow of the music, their emotions guided by her talent. Some leaned back, eyes wide, while others clapped softly along with the rhythm, unable to resist the beauty of what they were hearing. The young waitress's focus never wavered. She played with passion and precision, letting the music speak for itself. Each note carried a sense of purpose, each phrase telling a part of the story she wanted to share. The room responded in kind, the guests leaning in, some standing, all captivated. The piano had become a vessel for her expression, and she commanded it fully, transforming the evening into something unforgettable. The millionaire watched in silent frustration and awe. His plan to humiliate her had been completely undone, replaced by admiration and astonishment. He could not help but feel a grudging respect for the young woman who had turned the situation around with nothing more than her talent and composure. The guests, now fully engaged, clapped and cheered quietly between phrases, unable to contain their appreciation. It was clear that she had captured the room, and he could no longer claim attention or dominance. The young waitress continued, her hands moving with speed and precision, her expression calm yet focused. She had entered the party expecting to work, perhaps with some nerves, but now she had become the star. Her music had shifted the energy of the room, transforming it from a display of wealth and status into a shared experience of beauty and emotion. Every guest felt the impact of her playing, and even the staff took notice, pausing in their duties to appreciate the moment. As the performance reached its climax, the music soared, the notes flying with clarity and intensity. The room was filled with a sense of wonder and admiration. Guests were captivated, some closing their eyes, some leaning forward, all caught in the spell of the music. The young waitress's talent had become undeniable, her skill and confidence shining through every movement. She had turned a potential humiliation into a triumph, proving that her abilities could command respect regardless of the setting. The millionaire finally stepped back, his expression a mixture of surprise, discomfort, and respect. He had tried to assert control, to entertain his guests at her expense, yet she had outshone him effortlessly. The audience's attention was entirely on her, and he could not deny the impact of her performance. He realized that true talent and confidence were far more powerful than wealth or social standing, and that the young waitress had demonstrated this in the most graceful and effective way possible. The young waitress's final notes resonated throughout the hall, lingering in the air like a gentle reminder of the power of skill and dedication. The guests erupted into applause, some standing, some clapping with enthusiasm, all showing genuine admiration. She allowed herself a small, humble smile, acknowledging the appreciation without letting it distract her. She had proven herself, not through arrogance, but through talent, grace, and confidence. The millionaire watched as the audience continued to praise her, realizing that he had underestimated her entirely. He had tried to humiliate her, but instead, he had witnessed something extraordinary. The young waitress had taken control of the room, captivated the guests, and transformed the party with her music. She had shown that true skill and authenticity could command respect, and he could do nothing to change that. As she stepped away from the piano, the applause continued, and the energy in the room remained elevated. Guests shared looks of amazement, whispering to each other about the remarkable performance they had just witnessed. Even those who had expected entertainment at her expense were now part of a shared experience of admiration and wonder. The young waitress had turned a potentially humiliating moment into a victory, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. She walked through the room with her head held high, proud of what she had accomplished. The piano had become her voice, her confidence and talent evident in every note she played. The millionaire stood back, unable to reclaim the spotlight, and the guests were left with a memory they would not soon forget. The young waitress had transformed the evening, proving that skill, dedication, and authenticity could shine brighter than wealth, arrogance, or status. Her performance had reached its emotional peak, leaving everyone in the room in awe of her remarkable talent and grace. The applause was thunderous as the last note lingered in the grand hall, a soft echo that seemed to carry the emotions of everyone present. Guests were on their feet, clapping, cheering, and whispering to one another in amazement. The young waitress had risen from the piano, her hands still trembling slightly from the intensity of the performance, yet her face held a quiet, humble smile. She had done more than play music. She had captivated an entire room, transforming doubt into admiration and turning an attempt at humiliation into a moment of triumph. The millionaire, who had watched the entire performance with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect, finally approached her. He cleared his throat, trying to regain a sense of control over the situation. His usual confident smirk was gone, replaced by a subtle tension that revealed how unprepared he was for what had just occurred. He extended his hand toward her, a gesture of acknowledgement, though he did not speak immediately. The guests watched this exchange, curious about the reaction of someone who had attempted to dominate the evening only to be completely overshadowed. The young waitress accepted his handshake with grace, her smile never faltering. She did not need to say anything. Her music had spoken for her. The guests began to gather around, some offering compliments, others asking questions about her background and how she had learned to play with such skill. The young waitress answered politely, sharing small details about her life and the hours of practice she had dedicated to the piano since childhood. She spoke with humility, never boasting, letting her words reflect the same sincerity that had been evident in her performance. Some guests, who had initially arrived expecting to witness a casual, perhaps even amusing, performance, were now captivated by the story of her dedication and talent. They listened intently as she described the quiet hours spent perfecting pieces, the challenges she had faced, and the joy that playing the piano brought her. Each guest could sense the authenticity in her voice, the genuine passion that had shone through every note she had played. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely, from one of wealth and casual entertainment to one of respect and admiration for someone who had proven herself through talent and perseverance. The millionaire, observing this transformation, felt a mixture of emotions. He had hoped to entertain his guests at her expense, to assert his dominance and reinforce his own sense of superiority. Instead, he had witnessed someone rise above expectations, demonstrating skill, composure, and confidence in a way that left him unable to compete. He realized that his wealth and status had no bearing on the admiration she had earned. True respect could only be commanded through genuine talent and integrity, and she had demonstrated both in abundance. The guests continued to converse in hushed tones, praising her performance and sharing their astonishment. Some reached for their phones to record a few moments, wanting to capture the memory of a performance that would not soon be forgotten. Others simply allowed themselves to remain present, absorbing the beauty and skill that had filled the room. The young waitress moved through the crowd gracefully, accepting compliments and nodding politely, her demeanor calm and composed despite the attention she was receiving. A few of the millionaire's friends approached, clearly impressed despite their initial intentions. They asked her questions about her training, her experiences, and her favorite pieces to play. She responded with warmth and humility, never seeking to dominate the conversation but simply sharing her love of music. Her answers reflected the same dedication and sincerity that had been evident in her performance, reinforcing the admiration that was now widespread among the guests. The music that had filled the room now lingered in everyone's minds, creating a sense of awe and appreciation that extended beyond the immediate moment. Guests found themselves talking about the nuances of her performance, the emotional depth she had conveyed, and the skill with which she had navigated each piece. Even those who had initially been skeptical or dismissive were now fully engaged, acknowledging her talent with genuine admiration. The young waitress felt a quiet satisfaction as she moved away from the piano. She had not sought attention, yet she had captured it through her dedication and authenticity. She understood that the experience was more than just a performance. It was a demonstration of the power of skill, confidence, and sincerity. The applause and admiration of the guests were not just recognition of her talent, but an acknowledgement of her ability to remain true to herself under pressure. The millionaire, reflecting on the evening, began to understand the lesson that had unfolded before him. His attempt to humiliate her had been undone not through confrontation or argument, but through the undeniable force of her talent and presence. He realized that wealth and status could not replace skill, dedication, and authenticity. The young waitress had turned an environment designed to favor privilege into one where merit and passion shone brighter than any material display. As the evening continued, guests continued to discuss the performance, their conversations filled with admiration and wonder. Some sought to meet her personally, to express their appreciation, while others simply reflected on the unexpected experience they had witnessed. The young waitress accepted each interaction with humility, grateful for the recognition but never allowing it to overshadow her composure or integrity. The room, once dominated by wealth, chatter, and superficial conversations, had been transformed by her music. Guests were no longer focused on appearances or status. They were captivated by the genuine skill and expression that had filled the hall. The young waitress had created a moment that transcended social barriers, reminding everyone present that true talent and dedication could command attention and respect regardless of background or circumstance. The millionaire, observing this transformation, felt a quiet change within himself. He had entered the evening expecting control and dominance, yet he had been humbled by the demonstration of skill and authenticity. He realized that admiration earned through genuine talent and integrity was far more meaningful than any display of wealth or power. The young waitress had taught a subtle but powerful lesson, one that left a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. As the night drew on, the young waitress continued to interact with the guests, sharing small stories about her experiences with music and the joy it had brought her throughout her life. She spoke with warmth, humility, and sincerity, reinforcing the impression she had made with her performance. The guests listened attentively, their admiration deepening with each word, and some even reflected on their own lives, inspired by her dedication and passion. The applause and admiration persisted, creating an atmosphere of celebration and respect. The young waitress had turned what could have been a moment of humiliation into a defining experience, not only for herself but for everyone in the room. The guests had witnessed a display of genuine talent, humility, and confidence that transcended the usual measures of wealth and status. She had become a symbol of the power of dedication and authenticity, leaving a lasting impression that would be remembered long after the evening ended. The millionaire, finally accepting the outcome, approached her one last time. He offered a sincere compliment, acknowledging her talent and the impact of her performance. The young waitress nodded politely, her expression calm and composed, accepting the acknowledgement without arrogance. The guests, witnessing this interaction, sensed the shift in dynamic, recognizing the quiet triumph of skill and authenticity over status and wealth. As the party slowly came to a close, the young waitress prepared to leave. She had experienced something extraordinary, a moment where her talent and dedication had been recognized and celebrated in a way she had never expected. She walked through the grand hall with her head held high, proud of the way she had handled herself, confident in her abilities, and grateful for the acknowledgement of her skill. The guests continued to speak in hushed tones, their admiration evident, and even the millionaire's presence was subdued, his earlier arrogance replaced by respect. The night had been transformed by her music, and the young waitress had proven that true talent and authenticity could shine brighter than wealth, status, or attempts at humiliation. She had turned a potentially challenging situation into a defining moment, leaving a lasting impression on everyone present. As she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a sense of fulfillment and quiet pride, knowing that she had faced a challenge, shared her gift, and emerged victorious not through confrontation, but through skill, grace, and authenticity. The story of her performance would remain with the guests long after the lights of the mansion had dimmed, a reminder of the power of talent, dedication, and the courage to shine.